like to sit down and discover, do more of, or something new and totally different, just let us know. We actually really take this to heart, so this is pretty important. And when you finish with it, you can just put it over here on the table. It's totally anonymous, unless you want to put your name and say, Krishna, I need you to help me with this, in which case you should probably let me know to contact you. Also on your table, you'll see a canvas. That is our newsletter. Most of you know about this very well. Please feel free to take them home, give them to friends, share the news about the museum so that they know about the programs that we have and the exhibitions. And even, I'm very proud in here, we talked about the Catherine Wiley purchase. And so it's very important to our communities that they know what we're doing because they're part of what makes us so special. And speaking of what makes us so special, I love that segue. I'm trying to market our free admission posters. I need my intern up here doing Vanna White for me. But we have these posters. What we don't have is a huge army to help us get the news out into our community. So if you have a place that you frequent and you would love to take one or two or three, I have a stack over here. So please help yourself and help us spread the word. So there's an extra one up here, so if we're totally out, come grab my prop. I'm happy to spread the news. After the talk, Mark Bradley Shelf is our featured artist today, one of our contemporary focused artists. And after the talk here, we're actually going to go up into the gallery so we can have a more intimate dialogue between the pieces on the walls and you. So be sure to stick around for that. It'll be a little shorter in here than usual. Mark, just to give you a little information about him, he produces small, intricately crafted paintings and works on paper based on his own manipulated photographs of local urban environments. You'll see a little bit of that upstairs. He uses tape to create precise areas of thick paint that emphasize, I thought I heard someone coming in, that emphasize the surface texture of his compositions in a way that destroys the elements of photorealist illusion. And I think he's going to talk about that later, so you can ask him about that.
As a matter of fact, I am. So.
Excellent. Prevailing themes in his work include consumption and growth, expansion and recession, and the elegance of brutality. Some of you already know Mark. He's based in Chattanooga. He teaches arts foundation courses at the University of Tennessee, Chattanooga, and the Chattanooga State Technical Community College. So please help me welcome Mark today.
First and foremost, thank you all for being here, and thank you to Knoxville Museum of Art. You all are incredibly hospitable and nice and wonderful, and it's a true honor, so I appreciate it greatly. I'm a big fan of trying to share kind of hidden ideas behind artists, and I'm not going to spend too much time on looking at Bugs Bunny, but I think it's an important place to start for me, and you might actually see some of these elements pop up. They're very hidden elements. But as a child, really the first visual experience I had was watching Tom and Jerry, Bugs Bunny, and it didn't go away. As I got older, I found The Simpsons, and if you notice, the gentleman next to Homer is actually Jasper Johns, who actually did make a cameo in The Simpsons. Aside from that, growing up, humor, animation are huge influences in me. Kids in the Hall, which is a Canadian group, kind of like Monty Python, that I grew up on religiously. So this is my diet, watching as much cartoons as I can, good cartoons. Funny cartoons, watching as much comedy as I possibly can. Again, good comedy. And then also the musical influence of Tom Waits, who has a horrible sense of humor as well. These are all things that kind of made me at a very young age. And how I translate that is not always seen, but I want to share that with you before I get to the really serious stuff. But to be quite honest, as a child, my first memories of really enjoying the visual language are sitting on the couch with my father as he drank his orange juice and we watched Bugs Bunny and chuckled together. It's a very sincere moment. And if you look at things like, and I'll point this out later, I hope this works, these little bands of color really will come up a lot later. And in fact, all my palette from undergraduate and after undergraduate work, I finally realized somewhere along the line, I'm just ripping off Warner Brothers, which is fine. I've changed a little bit of that as time's gone on, but I want to kind of start on a light note because some of the stuff I'm going to talk about is actually very sincere and kind of delicate in some ways. So I'll start with the serious stuff now. And I'll read this verbatim here. It is interesting to observe how assiduously nature seeks to remedy these labored art blunders. She corrodes the iron and marble and gradually levels the hill, which is always heaped up as if a sufficiently heavy quantity of clods cannot be laid on the dead. Arching grasses come one by one, seeds come flying on downy wings, silent as fate, to give life's dearest beauty for the ashes of art, and strong evergreen arms laden with ferns and tillandsia, drapery are spread over all. Life at work everywhere, obliterating all memory of the confusion of man. This is from John Muir. Something I find really intriguing and what I'm really kind of drawn to is all of how we occupy and how we inhabit space. But what I love about how we inhabit space, it's all very temporary. So when I'm walking down a sidewalk and I see this man-made structure being broken apart by the smallest little pieces of grass or moss, I find that fascinating. And when I see abandoned structures that are being overtaken, I find comfort in that actually, in a lot of different ways. For me, art is the observation of science, and science is the art of observation. Now, although science and art are usually not consolidated, or they're kind of consolidated to separate realms in a lot of ways, the two are not mutually predisposed to one another. In fact, I find that to be quite opposite. Their very existence of both science and art hinges upon the same foundation, and that's the human response to observable reality. Both internal and external, macroscopic and microscopic. The aim of my work in particular is not to arouse outrage over degraded environments, nor is it meant to celebrate the current state of our existence, saying we're so awesome, we're humans, we can do anything. It's somewhere in between. My art is really about observation. My work is, however, my own personal direct response to how we, as a civilization, both inhabit and occupy space. In many different ways, some people have called me a landscape painter. I suppose that's partially true. Other people have said, oh, you're kind of a pop artist because you're kind of like taking consumer culture to a different level. I probably fall somewhere in between, but I look at works like Thomas Cole and Rackstraw Downs and really, sure, I could be a landscape painter because I'm paying attention to the landscape in which I'm most frequent, what is around me the most. But dealing with architectural form, I would say the works of Hopper have had a pretty significant impact on me, and I think he treats his architecture in a very figurative way. His structures seem very much alive, whereas figures seem quite vacant. And I think this is a good example. If you look at this very well iconic piece of Hopper, I'd say the protagonists, these have more identity, and even this has more identity than this lonely man that's sitting there. And if you look at a lot of Hopper's work, his figures tend to never make eye contact. They tend to be very vacant, where his architecture has this sort of figurative element. And I'm a big fan of trying to kind of encapsulate that very same sense. Other artists such as Charles Sheeler certainly have had a profound impact on me, especially his composition. But Sheeler's work tends to celebrate industry and celebrate the kind of man-made aspect. Mine is not necessarily a celebration, but much more of an observation. Again, speaking about influences, certainly the way in which Richard Diebenkorn paints and applies paint has a huge, profound impact on me. Again, also observing, keen observation. Works of Toba Kadori. This is a very large, giant sheet of paper that's been stapled together, and upon closer inspection, you see this very heightened, very illustrative realism of this continuation of these doors that kind of go on. And I usually like to throw in Emmett Gowan, who's a photographer. I'm not just relegated to looking at painting, and I'm not just relegated to looking at just photo or design. I kind of look at everything I possibly can. Emmett Gowan's work had a profound impact on me as well, especially while I was in grad school. He actually came to visit. And his work is aerial photography that is looking at sites that quite often are really, they're nuclear test sites, they're wastewater management sites, they're sites that are not meant to be beautiful. But once they are put into the context of a photograph, there is something that happens. They almost become drawings in a sense. Now, this is some of my earlier work. And you may even see some blue that you could easily see in a Bugs Bunny cartoon. There it is. It's right there. My work kind of embodies the theme of expansion and recession. And in particular, the theme of consumption comes up a lot. It's a big driver for me. And for several years, my work was examining how we alter the environment and how we construct our own landscape. That's a Bugs Bunny blue if I've ever seen one. Now, this is 2004. My worldview had matured quite a bit when I went to grad school. And so the intent of my work also changed quite a bit. In my graduate studies at UNC, I began to revisit the landscape work that I was working on, right after undergraduate. But I wanted to do something different. I wanted to somehow look at the landscape through a different lens. And so I started looking at aerial images. I was looking at surveillance technology. And I was engaging in courses outside my discipline. I was taking courses in political geography and urban geography. And I began to utilize the tools of surveillance technologies to kind of further study of how we define and how we control and how we map space. This area of study was also coupled with my independent research in UNC's microscopy lab, where Dr. Bagnell was very gracious to allow me access. And I was able to examine bacteria and parasite and cancer cells. And this really fueled my interest in the kind of the macro-micro duality. This talk is going to go all over the map. I just want you to know that. You probably weren't expecting to look at cancer cells today. But to give you a real kind of insight to what makes me think and what makes me tick, this timely research very much coincided with my own father's battle. He was diagnosed with cancer right before I was to go to grad school. He had throat cancer. And this was a pretty cathartic process, I won't lie, where I'm looking at urban mapping systems and I'm looking at these cancer cells. And I actually have direct access to some of them. And Dr. Bagnell could not figure out for the life of him why an art student wanted to look at these cells, but he was very gracious. And as I delved further into the research, kind of attempting to make more politically active work, linking human behavior with that of the behavior of cancer cells or bacteria cells, I kind of hit a wall. I had one instructor that was egging me on because she was such a political activist herself, like, yes, take it to the mountaintops, they're horrible. And that finally kind of hit me, we are all the same. No matter how small or how large, how simple or how complex an organism is, we all expand and we all recede. And at that point in time, I didn't really feel that I had anything left to say. It's just obvious. Why would I need to say anything more? In fact, no organic organism or no organism is any different. All things must expand and ultimately recede. All things grow and must contract. So these are some studies that I was doing while I was in graduate school. And it's true of all animal, plant, even geological forms. And oddly enough, I found kind of solace in this kind of process. I didn't want to say my hat was off to the cancer cells, job well done guys, but what I am saying was that we all have a job to do, unfortunately, however bad or good that may be. And it allowed me to kind of look at geological forms. And again, it's not to say I celebrated my father's passing. It was kind of the reason I went to grad school, was his encouragement. But it is to say, however, that we simply cannot control the inevitable patterns that are inherent to a mortal life. So I began to avoid making overt statements in my work, to be quite honest. I began to latch onto the theme of consumption, a commonality among all living organisms, exploring how landforms constantly compete for superiority, whether through wind erosion or actual just erosion from rivers, whether it's seismic activity, that deserts become pastures, pastures become deserts. Sometimes there were ancient lake beds. I mean, everything changes. And through this sort of like cathartic process, I ended up with a pretty lively series of abstract work that was to map out that sort of theme of growth, that expansion and recession, and the political geography comes into context too, that all these little areas, and it's how I would paint these. I would kind of paint this form, and then I'd paint another form, and another form, like who's going to win? Maybe the green will win. I don't know. And so they would kind of keep growing and ebbing and flowing, and finally I would say, I'm done. This is the snapshot for right now. And this would be kind of considered like, or influenced by the aerial photography I was looking at. But these are completely fictional aerial landscapes. This area of studio research also culminated in two distinct series. One yielded abstract results, while the other, representational imagery with a conceptual foundation, kind of found their way back into my studio. Painting abstractly was the hardest thing I did in graduate school, hands down. That summer in between both years, I went back to make sure I knew how to paint, because I questioned it a lot. I'm like, do I know what I'm doing? And on my walks to and from school, I would see dumpster after dumpster, and I'd say, oh, there's so many dumpsters in this world. This is crazy. And I start looking at them more. I'm like, they sure are kind of pretty in a weird way. And it's like, how? And all of a sudden it hit me. I'm like, oh, these are such icons of consumption. This goes perfectly with what I'm doing. So it gave me a chance to kind of breathe again in between semesters to say, yeah, I do know how to paint. This is great. But I also want to make sure my sense of humor is still working. And so I had to go to Lowe's and Home Depot and find my color charts. And this one chart I found at Home Depot was American Traditions color samples. And I'm like, well, that's just perfect. And so it's like the gods gave me this. I have to use this. And so I'm looking at how you're supposed to paint a bathroom, paint your dining room, both your accent wall and your trim, and end up with Canyon Red Rock Dumpster and Subtle Taupe. You know, I think that's funny. It hits all the points, right? Or maybe it's La Fonda Sonoran Dumpster and Natural Limit. It might be Aquaview Dumpster and Woodlawn Lace. You know, you take your pick. The names are absurd. The colors are beautiful because that's how you're supposed to paint your interior. These are consumer colors. I had a thing for dumpsters. I still do. Isolated dumpster in Pantone 128U. And so I'm actually matching the color samples or the designer color samples to make my oil paints, you know, do exactly what I want them to. And I will say this to my students when I teach painting, like, I can't get my color right. Tell you what, go to Home Depot, go to Lowe's, spend a summer trying to match color, and you will get it on the nail, in the head. It's actually a good exercise. So I began looking at things that also represented, I had a loaded message, but maybe not overt, because I didn't really want to hit anyone over the head anymore. This is vacant security, finding like abandoned, you know, security or guard shacks. I found to be really poetic. These things guard nothing now. This is vacant security number 2. And actually, interestingly enough, this one no longer exists. So a lot of the work that I'm looking at is also a form of documentation. It's not the main reason I do it, but there is a nice sort of sentimentality I do develop with these forms, that this guy is gone. He was a lovely little guy out in this abandoned foundry and became a home for a lot of homeless for a long time. And I am kind of sad that he's no longer there. Whether it's used car lots, you know, I have to find these images beautiful, and I do, although they may represent something that's very insidious. Another thing that kind of popped up in research, not so much with the work that's in this show, but upon a completion of a certain series that really had a lot of dumpsters and porta potties and other images, I began to see a new facet in my work, and one that was kind of rooted in scientific study in a way. And I began to see my subjects sometimes as indicator species. So you know, if one of these species shows up or goes away, the environment's going to change. Same thing. So you may be out hiking, and you might all of a sudden see this thing pop up. That's not its natural habitat. That's not a good sign. Someone's going to build there. If you know you see one of those pop up, someone's going to have something going on there. See, porta potties, there's going to be some kind of activity that weekend, right? Same sort of thing. I'm like, oh, these are indicator species. How interesting. And so there was a series I did for the Hunter Museum a few years back that was very much based on this. So here's this portable toilet that showed up in this parking lot, became a storage unit. And so now we have isolated La Fonda jalapeno green portable toilet. Indicator species, right? Portable toilet on a future retail development, and now it's Green Life and all this huge activity. It's actually a Whole Foods now. And so we'll get portable toilet in the Fonda Deep Olive Field. One of the most sort of profound indicator species is a little dark. You know, how do we deal with things that are dark? And these FEMA trailers showed up, this is after Katrina, that showed up outside of Chattanooga, and they sat on the tracks for about 2 weeks. And they just sat there. And you can look down either way, and it's endless. It's a pretty haunting image. But in order to deal with it in a positive way, you can get FEMA trailer and honey tea. And it is a beautiful, it becomes beautiful. You can kind of tolerate, you know, how this is, how we're dealing with our current state of things. Interestingly enough, a gentleman from Oxford University is going to be using this for a website, this image for a website that deals with the health effects of these FEMA trailers. And I'm like, perfect. You know, you found the right guy. And then we have Montague Field of Rossville Boulevard. And this field actually is supposed to be a playground, but they can't build on it because it actually has so much methane deposits because it used to be a landfill. So it turns into Montague Field and Alice Blue Sky. Now, this is the only piece that sold fairly quickly out of that series. They all went to homes, but this one went to like this boutique hotel. And I was trying to tell them what all my work is about. Like, I don't want to hear that. And it's like, but it's on the landfill and all this other stuff. Like, no, this one's pretty. It's like, but I did get a porta potty in there. I just want to make sure that they know that I still fooled them in some way. Another thing I really kind of want to talk about that kind of affects my work quite a bit, this is the work of Gerhard Richter. This is not mine. I cannot take credit. There's a slew of other artists that are also making paintings that are kind of brought about by newspaper clippings, or they're brought about by old photographs, and there's a certain level of sort of distortion that's starting to happen. It's the work of Luke Toymans. The Renaissance and Baroque painters used the picture plane kind of as a mirror or a window. And the artists of the 70s and late 60s and 70s, the photorealist, used their painting to be kind of a lens. But there are painters right now that are using sort of their canvas much more as a monitor. And there's a reason that I think that exists. And there's something that I'm not necessarily always conscious of, but something I've become aware of, that there is a group of artists out there that are trying to offer a little bit more of a monitor-like realization of how we see the world. We all live behind screens. We communicate through them. We see the world through them, both imagined as well as real. This is an image of a computer game. I think this is Grand Theft Auto. And you can see the way in which they're painting this structure. I'm sorry, I shouldn't say paint. The way they're designing that structure is how I'd paint it. And you will see images of, say, Second Life. I mean, that's clean right there. And that's kind of how I make a painting. I want it to be clean. I want it to be simple. So these things really do have a pretty profound influence on me. I'm not saying I don't play Second Life. I don't play Grand Theft Auto. But I did have somebody recently at a show, not that long ago, tell me how realistic my paintings were. I'm like, what are you talking about? It's like, oh, they're so real, man. That's great. It's like, do you play a lot of video games? Like, oh yeah, I'm a big gamer. I'm like, oh, got it, okay. So that makes sense. So there's a way in which we are kind of interpreting forms, and we're seeing forms differently. We see the world differently than we did, say, 5, 10, 15, especially 100 years ago. And as I said, I certainly am still holding on to some of those political geographical sort of lessons that I've learned. Surveillance technology has a huge impact on me. But we are seeing ways that were once thought unimaginable. We couldn't have seen images like this, say, 75 years ago. It was impossible. Say 150 years ago, to even imagine, trying to do this, it's just absurd. Now we can tell what time it is in someone's watch from a satellite if we wanted. Time and space, points A and B, were so far apart for so long, and as technology is introduced, points A and B get closer and closer and closer to communicate back and forth. Now points A and B are very much compressed. And these are the things that I look at. So you have to take a grain of salt. You have to think about the Bugs Bunny that's running around in my head. You have to think about the urban geography and the political geography that's running around and the surveillance technology. You mix all of that up, and that's what you end up getting, is the work that's up in the show right now. I love maps. I truly do. And yet, if it wasn't for the visual language, we wouldn't be able to communicate these ideas. Color, line, and shape. There's a lot of bad things in the world, I'm not going to lie. But I also think it's important to look at the good things that are popping up. This is a horrible image, but at the same time, it's not stopping, actual growth. There's your expansion and recession right there. It's chaotic. And that's kind of why I paint the things that I paint, because they are harsh. And if I can tolerate them and learn to love them, things are going to be all right. That's what I tell myself. Our immediate world that we have kind of created for us is a painful reality for me in many ways. The consumerism, the consumption, what we're asked to buy, without thinking twice how it affects us or other civilizations. But if I must confront it, I will do so in some way that reveals the elegance of brutality. And I found this lovely image on the internet. I'm like, dumpsters, awesome. Just for me. To give you another frame of reference, I'm a cataloger. I catalog the living daylights out of stuff. I have file after file after file of just images. And you'll see airport, appropriated images, billboards, campers, Porta potties. I mean, these are things that most people will not have folders of. And then, of course, each folder contains these large archives of just stuff. So I guess I am kind of like a pack rat of images. And most of them never get used, but I do review them on a pretty regular basis. And sometimes I'll find like, oh, I forgot all about you. Like an old girlfriend or a friend or something. I'm like, oh, we need to go out more. So I'll make it a painting. So I'll show you this last batch of work, then we can go upstairs here in just a bit. But I have to find beauty that is in the objects that normally are not assigned beauty. This is a retro strawberry gray dumpster in retro red. And this is a dumpster that's hooked up to the side of a building. It's just like just a bag or a trough to receive garbage. But there's a beauty to it. I love its form. I truly do. This is egg yolk dumpster in Windjammer. This is conifer guard shack in Niagara Mist. MS028 billboard in Flying Jib. These names make no sense. I love bathrooms, porta potties. And this is one off of going down to Florida. And my wife, it drives her nuts because I'll say, pull over, pull over. She's like, what are you taking a picture of now? That restroom, it's gorgeous. And my kids they laugh at me, and that's good. I'm totally fine with that. And even my son will say, hey, do you like that dumpster over there? I'm like, yeah, I certainly do. It's great. Everything from ticket booths to things that really annoy us, to have to pay to park and all these things. But I want to give them some level of identity, some level of recognition. And this is, in fact, this is our environment. This is our landscape. There's even beauty on walls of, say, Family Dollar. At least I think there is. And so some of the work that you see in the show is very much rooted in sort of my observation. All the images that I take have to be vacant. They have to be neglected. They have to be overlooked. And then it's my job to come in and love them and rehabilitate them for myself. And every so often, I'm also a big fan that you have to play and you have to experiment from time to time. Oh, and by the way, if you remember the Bugs Bunny one with the Roadrunner and Coyote with those strips of color, there it is. That was unintentional. And when I was pulling up images last night, I threw that Bugs Bunny one in. I'm like, ah, there it is. We're back. But as I said about playing, these works that are up in the show as well are old postcards that were kind of thrown out. And so I do a lot of mixed media, and I do a lot of experimentation in the studio, but they had buildings on them, so I thought, why not? So I do allow myself to play. I'm not always this really serious artist that's trying to, make people see the world differently. Sometimes I just like to paint. And these much more are just kind of, that's just me at play. I do like abstraction still. So even this utility tent that was housing some kind of work they were doing off of a highway, to abstract it, to allow it to become an object and to become of interest. But again, I am looking at these mapping systems, I'm looking at spatial systems that will influence the abstraction that I'm currently doing. This is a recent abstraction. And I think it's important to have that level. Are we on? Okay. I think it's important level to have that sort of dialogue in the studio, because I never want to get in a rut again, because I was in a rut before I went to graduate school. And being able to be pluralistic in my approach, whether it's abstract, mixed media, or painting, and whether or not I'm known for one body over the other, that doesn't matter to me, so long as we're all having a dialogue. And hopefully you can see, where I'm getting at least these influences, right? I'm not copying anything. They're all being it's very intuitive, but I'm constantly kind of scoping and exploring how, again, we define space, how we occupy space, how we inhabit space. And sometimes the two will converge, such as here. That's a dumpster, mind you. There's several dumpsters on top of one another. And I'll end here to give you kind of like a snapshot. This is what my studio looks like. This is me at work. And you can see that these are rubbings right here that were done as I tape off a lot of edges. So these are actually influencing these. And then I'm working on gravel mounds. I'm a really exciting guy. And then over here we have mixed media pieces that are going. So I can always have something in the studio going. So I never want to ever go into my studio and say, oh, I don't want to work today, I don't have anything to work on. I don't have that luxury, and I made sure I won't ever have that luxury. Still collect tons of color samples, and you can see I make little marks on them and everything. I'm a very methodical and mathematical person in some aspects. I shouldn't say mathematical, but I'm very methodical. Everything is taped off, cut to precise measurements. I go through a lot of X-Acto blades. I go through a lot of tape. And when it's all said and done, I cannot get rid of my own waste. This is about 3 years' worth of tape, and my son will sit on it, and he's like, you know, Dad, this is kind of a work of art. And I'm like, I know, I can't get rid of it. So my entire process, all the waste and all the consumption comes out of it, I can't let it go just yet. So aside from that, I hope that gives you a better kind of insight to my own sort of thought process.